Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here today with Roy Shapira, Associate Professor at Reichman University, to discuss his paper, Specialist Directors, which he co-authored with Yaron Nili, Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So, Roy, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to me today.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
So your paper looks at this trend for investors to put pressure on boards to appoint so-called specialist directors who bring expertise in specific areas such as cyber, climate change, DEI, and so on. And your paper documents this phenomenon and then goes on to discuss its consequences, both for board behavior and policy. So I think it's really topical paper in many ways. I think it goes to the heart of the role of boards. And in the first part of your paper, you document the rising emphasis on expertise on boards, and associated with that, the increasing prevalence of these specialist directors. Can you put some numbers on that for us, and also define what it is you really mean by a specialist director?
Sure. So let's start with the definition, because that's the trickier part. So every director comes with expertise, right? When you enter the boardroom, you bring with you your prior knowledge and skill sets and experience. So the real question when we discuss board expertise is what types of expertise do we have on our board? And normally we discuss financial expertise or legal expertise or marketing expertise and things like that. But what we do in the paper is something different. We focus on 5 new types of domain-specific expertise that some of them you already mentioned. So the 5 are cyber, DEI, climate expertise, safety expertise, and kind of a general catch-all ESG expertise, which means that the director identifies as an ESG expert for whatever that means. Now, as you can probably already sense, perhaps the biggest issue is how do you define expertise in DEI? How do you define expertise in ESG? Now, there is no standard, there is no benchmark, no standard for definition. And so we had to go by what the companies themselves are telling us, what the directors themselves are disclosing. And when we read through all the disclosures of the S&P 500 companies over the last 6 years, we indeed documented a 20-fold or 30-fold in some cases increase in the prevalence of these specific skill sets. So just to illustrate, to give you just one example, back in 2016, across all S&P 500 companies, there were only 25 directors listed as cyber experts. By 2022, that number jumped to 723. So, and that most of the jump came just from the last 2 years, all right? And we documented similar orders of magnitude in the increases in DEI and climate and so on. So this tells us that we are witnessing a serious event unfolding, because usually changes in board compositions are glacial. They happen very slowly. But now we see this rapid increase. So this means that this is something that we should dig into further, understand what it means. Where did all these, new 700 cyber expert directors come from? Are they new directors that the company just recruited from the outside? Are they all directors that were already there in 2016? It's just that at some point in time, in 2020, the company puts all the directors on a 2-day cybersecurity boot camp, and now everybody's checking the cyber expertise box. Yeah. So these are the questions that were fascinating to us.
Yeah, and I think we'll come back to some of that, because you identify the problems of actually answering some of those questions because of some of the disclosure limitations. And perhaps then we could kind of go on to how you look at in the paper, how you look at these shifts could affect board behavior. And you look at that through a combination of board interviews as well as reviews of the research literature. And you identified 5 areas of potential concern, which I'd love to talk through with you. So the first 2 relate to how the board functions. So you highlight that injecting narrow expertise into boards could distort board dynamics and also create authority bias. Could you expand on that?
Sure. I'll take a small step back just to say that I think it's intuitive to think about the many advantages that adding directors with new types of expertise to boardrooms can bring, right? So you bring in someone who has knowledge and skills on topics that didn't used to be on the board's agenda, so they can help the board be more proactive on these issues. know what questions to ask, anticipate future problems, and so on. But at the same time, it's less intuitive to think, and this is why we dedicated most of our effort to think about the drawbacks of adding specific expertise. The first and most basic one is what you alluded to. I think most problems stem from basic principles of supply and demand. There's a very limited supply, a very limited pool of candidates of individuals who are quality directors and are also experts in specific fields such as climate change or cyber. The number of individuals that fit the criteria is much smaller than you would have imagined. And so when there's a sudden increase in demand, say that the SEC proposes a rule whereby all companies have to disclose whether they have cyber experts on their boards or not. When there's such a sudden increase in demand, when all large companies are looking to add directors from that specific limited pool, many companies, by definition, are bound up to add directors with lower than average traits, such as lower than average bandwidth or lower than average general understanding of the business.
Right.
So the first and basic worry is that, okay, so say that we added a director with expertise in cyber or in diversity or in climate, and that director managed to improve the quality of our board discussions on that specific topic. But because the supply is so limited, we may have hurt the quality of our board discussions on other topics that are more prevalent on the agenda, such as business strategy. So that's the first point, is the more intuitive point. The second point is more counterintuitive, which is adding a director with a specific expertise in a specific subject matter may actually hurt the quality of board discussions on that specific subject. And the reason is what you alluded to when you said authority bias, which means, translated to boards, say that we're in a company and now we add to the board a cyber expert or a climate expert. Now, all of a sudden, all the other directors tend to overly rely on the information or opinions coming from that perceived expert. They tell themselves, I don't necessarily need to educate myself to keep apprised of things that are going on in climate or in cyber, because I have that director sitting over there and she will take care of things. So that's the second drawback, the authority bias drawback.
And the next two concerns you highlight relate more to board composition. You say that expert directors could overly increase the size of boards and also hinder board diversity. How so?
Right. So companies can inject new expertise into their boardrooms, either by adding new members from the outside or by replacing old members. And we have indications in the data and in the interviews that companies more often than not choose to inject new expertise by adding new members. Now, over time, these constant additions of new members may end up growing the board beyond its optimal size. So once the board grows beyond a certain size, once the board becomes bloated, it slows down the communication, it hurts the coordination, it decreases your ability to reach consensus, and so on. And now, as for diversity, those who watch us at ECGI, I'm sure, are familiar with those efforts over the last few years to bring in more diversity into directors' demographics, gender diversity, minority group diversity, and so on. Now, those who care about these efforts, my co-author Yaron has written extensively about them. Those who care about these efforts should be mindful of how they clash with the more recent effort that we document to add specialist directors. And the reason goes back to what we just said a couple of minutes ago, the limited supply of candidates. If, for example, the pool of quality directors who are also cyber experts is predominantly male, then when directors choose to appoint directors only from these pools, this is bound to hurt the efforts to promote more female directors or more minority group directors. So that's the diversity problem.
So then finally, you talk about the danger of board washing, where an excessive focus on human capital disclosures camouflages how the board actually behaves. What do you mean by that?
Right. So it's a play on greenwashing. And I think the basic idea here is intuitive, which is companies are facing societal demands, and they can choose to respond to these demands either by changing their actual behavior or by changing their appearances. And the worry is that companies may find it tempting to use, like you said, board expertise disclosure to inflate their actual commitment to issues such as climate or diversity. And the reason that there is such a worry, and that is perhaps to me the most important point in the paper, the reason that there is such a worry is that the state of board expertise disclosure is not ideal, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
So we find many examples in the data set of you have the same director, he sits on several boards. In one board, he's designated as a cyber expert. In another board, he's not a cyber expert. Okay, so the state of board expertise disclosure at its current state is kind of a cheap talk environment.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's a cheap talk environment, it's an area that is ripe for board washing should companies choose to use it that way.
Right. Yeah, and we'll come back to that towards the end of this discussion, actually, when you talk about some of the implications for policy. But I think that these concerns that you're highlighting really go to the heart of a couple of topical issues for boards. I mean, the first is simply, what is the role of the board? Does it have to be representative in the sense of representing expertise, representing stakeholder backgrounds, representing society demographically, or is the board there to act as an integrator of information and perspectives from outside the board? And increasingly, norms and expectations seem to be pushing us towards the former view, but this strikes me as being potentially quite counterproductive, as we'll never be able to cover all the bases in that approach, and there will inevitably be gaps. If we take a step back, what does your research lead you to conclude about the role of boards more broadly and the direction we're taking on areas like expertise?
Yeah, just to piggyback on what you said, can I say something which is not so academic, Tom? I don't envy directors. I don't. We live in an era where the responsibility, the expectations of directors are ever expanding. More and more issues on the agenda. And even if you're the most public-spirited, dedicated, motivated individual, it will be very hard for you to be great at both advising and monitoring on all these issues. And so to me, that's perhaps the kind of the lawyer in me, but to me, the best advice that I could give individual directors is something that the former Chief Justice of Delaware once said about director oversight duties. He said that director oversight duties boil down to a three-letter word: try. Okay, just try. Make sure that you understand what are the main ways in which your company is making money and impacting others, and make sure that you try to keep informed and ask the questions about it. Keep your nose in, keep your hands out, try, and that's the best you can do. Now, perhaps more to your question at the board level, what the role of the board is, or what the role of the board ought to be. I think our research leads to the conclusion that trying to address first-order problems by focusing on a specific skill set, on a specific director, is not the way to do things. Environmental degradation, first-order problem. Inequality, first-order problem. User privacy, super important. And companies should care about these topics. But trying to address them through saying boards must have this specific skill set or be representative of that specific aspect is not the right way to do it.
I mean, unfortunately, it's an easy sort of lever to pull for, to reach for. And I think in the answers that you've given, we've already got a bit into the implications of your research for policy, but you do finish your paper with a series of recommendations for regulators, judges, and actually even your fellow academics. Can you summarize these?
Sure. So in a couple of sentences on each. For regulators, I think that the best thing to do may actually be to do nothing. Okay. So normally in all legal fields, one-size-fits-all interventions come with cost. But in our specific field of boards of directors and their composition, I think that one-size-fits-all interventions are especially problematic because everything is so company-specific. Adding a specific skill set, adding a specific director could add value, but only under very specific circumstances. To the extent that regulators do decide to intervene, and this is where we already kind of forecasted it in our previous discussion, to the extent that regulators do decide to intervene, we think that instead of focusing on adding specific traits, they should focus on ensuring that the board expertise disclosure is more credible, is more comparable. For judges, the biggest challenge would be, or the biggest dilemma would be whether to assess differently the liability of specialist directors. So say that we appointed a cyber expert to our board, and now 1 year from now, the company suffers a massive data breach with attendant legal and financial reputational harms in the billions. Should that specialist director be subject to enhanced scrutiny or not? Okay, so this is a question that we have surprisingly little guidance in the case law about, and we believe that it's going to change. Now, as for academics, I think what the research does is simply to try to situate these shifts in board expertise within the broader themes in corporate governance that we at ECGI constantly talk about. So to me, the two biggest developments in corporate governance over the past decade are ESG and compliance, right? Companies are facing increased regulatory and societal demands. So in response, companies are pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into compliance programs. And when these costly programs fail, regulators, investors, everybody are pointing fingers at the directors. So now these two developments are starting to combine to start to influence board composition and director skill sets. And whether you like this development or not, it's here to stay, right? Companies are disclosing much more about the director skill set. It becomes the standard. Everybody's adopting skill metrics in the reportings. Companies are adding directors with new skill sets. And now the question for academics in the next decade, and I'm sure that many will join this effort, would be to examine how these changes in board expertise affect corporate behavior. So say that we added a couple of directors with expertise in climate change. Did it change the way that companies are investing in or committed to fighting climate change? Say that we appointed a director with cyber expertise. Did it reduce the likelihood that our company will suffer a data breach or face an event-driven litigation, and so on?
I'd like to just probe a little bit more on the second of the points you made there around how the judiciary might interpret this
Sure.
greater director expertise, because I think that concern about additional liability and accountability will be of great interest to a lot of directors watching this. Could you just unpack that a little bit more? I mean, what are the directions that this could go in potentially, in your view?
Of course. So it could go two ways. Again, there's very little guidance in the case law. We have one decision kind of almost 20 years ago now about directors with financial expertise, where the analysis kind of implied that if you're a director with financial expertise and we're dealing with a certain like M&A transaction, I'm expecting more out of you. I'm expecting more out of you because of your financial expertise. When it comes to the different types of expertise, the more ESG related expertise that we're highlighting here, the new types of expertise, I believe that everybody will worry about it, but they don't have that much of a reason to worry.
Right.
And the reason is what I said 2 or 3 minutes ago about the way that courts, approach director oversight duty, which is my favorite topic. And the way that they approach it, the standard here is good faith or bad faith. The standard here, did you put in the effort? And if anything, I would think that having a cyber director or a climate director or a safety director on the board will reduce the risk of liability for all the other directors as well. Because the way that courts assess it is courts are not assessing you based on the outcome. Courts assessing you based on the efforts. And if that cyber director, if that safety director made sure to ask the question and ask for opinions and ask for information to flow up to the board level, then this will help all the other directors as well escape liability on these issues.
Well, that was really fascinating discussion. I definitely encourage our viewers and listeners to go and read the paper. It's very accessible, but also very important. So thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, Tom.